For those of you who've just joined us, who weren't at the annual general meeting we've just had, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm James Watt, the outgoing chairman of Cbrl. And I have actually just been replaced in that position by our very dear friend, Professor Robert Bewley of Oxford University, and I wish him all success in his tenure as chairman for the next 4 years. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our speakers this evening for the lecture, which follows the annual general meeting. And traditionally, this has been the major lecture of the year. And it's going to be on the subject of migration diplomacy in the Levant, lessons from the Syrian refugee crisis. And we have, as giving the talk, Dr. Gerasimos Tsourapas, who is well known as an expert on the matter, who's drawn on extensive interviews conducted across Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis. We're extremely grateful to him for giving this talk. And he will be in conversation with the director of our institute in Jerusalem, the Kenyan Institute, is Dr. Tawfiq Haddad, who is also the deputy director of Cbrl. Extremely grateful to him as well. So hoping that we now have our listeners in place and able to hear us, I'm going to hand over straight away to Dr. Tawfiq Haddad. Thank you, Tawfiq.
Thank you, James, for that introduction. For those of us, or those who are on the webinar who have not attended before and who are perhaps less familiar with the Council for British Research in the Levant, I just wanted to sort of give a little introduction to who we are. We're an independent UK registered charity that engages in humanities and social science research in the Levant, aiming to be the UK's portal into the region. We are supported by the British Academy and are part of one of a cluster of 8 different international research institutes. The institute which I direct, the Kenyan Institute in Jerusalem, has been around for more than 100 years. And today's webinar is part of obviously the new virtual world that we entered in terms of a successful series of webinars that we've held so far. This, I believe, is the 15th so far, and we're very excited to have Dr. Gerasimos Tsourapas, if I get the name correct, who is also a board member and trustee of the Council for British Research in the Levant, speaking about a very interesting topic today, that of the question of Syrian refugees and what he calls refugee rentierism. So this, I imagine we have a very interested audience in this subject, and he's very much an expert on it. Well, let me go straight to actually introducing Gerasimos. He's a senior lecturer in Middle East politics at the University of Birmingham. And his research focuses on the politics of migrants, refugees, and diasporas in the Middle East and the global South. He's written on the international dimensions of authoritarianism as well. Gerasimos' first book, The Politics of Migration in Modern Egypt, Strategies for Regime Survival in Autocracies, which came out from Cambridge Press in 2019, was awarded the 2020 NMISA Distinguished Book Award by the International Studies Association. His second book, Migration Diplomacy in the Middle East and North Africa, Power, Mobility, and the State, is forthcoming with Manchester University Press. Before I hand things over to Gerasimos to present what we envision will be a roughly 20-minute lecture, followed by a 15 to 20-minute engagement on my behalf with him, followed by an opening up of the the forum for questions from the audience, a few housekeeping notes. If you would like, this webinar is being recorded as we speak, and there were more than 160 people who were registered for it to begin with. Should you like to actually ask a question or make a point, please do so, but you will only be able to do so from the Zoom room itself, from the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. We are also live streaming this on Facebook, which tends to get us a lot more traffic as well. Please keep your questions to short and pithy, and we will go through them, and I will try and do my best to go through as many questions as I can to point them to Gerasimos. With that introduction, I will hand over to Gerasimos now to take us away with migration diplomacy in the Levant, lessons from the Syrian refugee crisis. Take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to FIC. Thank you, James. And of course, thank you to Cbrl for extending this very kind invitation to present the annual lecture, AGM lecture this year on a topic that's particularly dear to me, migration diplomacy in the Levant. This is arguably something that continues to affect world politics today, some almost 10 years now since the beginning of the Syrian civil war. One way to get us going in this 20 minutes I have to talk to you is this visual image, this picture of the Zatari camp in Jordan. Of course, a refugee camp built for Syrians by the Jordanian government, partly in order to make the issue of Syrian refugees in Jordan visible to the international community. So this is a camp, arguably the largest organized concentration of Syrian refugees in the world. And it is built by the Jordanian government to demonstrate the extent of this issue to an international audience. And the rationale behind this forms part of what I'm going to talk to you today. Two questions drive this project forward. First is, how do refugee flows feature in the foreign policies of host states of first asylum? And by that we mean countries, particularly across the global south, that are tasked with managing influxes of refugees and asylum seekers as the first respondents, quote unquote. These are countries such as Jordan, Lebanon, but also states like Pakistan, Kenya, and a number of other sub-Saharan African and Latin American countries that are tasked with managing a very large number of refugees with very meager resources. So the question that drives this project forward is, well, how do they manage this? And how does their foreign policy allow them to manage refugees in a sort of sustainable manner? And more concretely, the second question has to do with the Syrian refugee crisis itself. How has the Syrian refugee crisis affected two states' diplomacy, in particular, the Jordanian state and the Lebanese state? And how have they used foreign policy to manage the influx of Syrians within their territory? It might not make immediate sense to compare Jordan and Lebanon, but I argue that these countries share a number of important similarities. For this project, what is particularly interesting is that both of them developed very similar responses that have to do with portraying the two countries as suffering or being on the verge of a state collapse as a result of the refugee influx. So we see King Abdullah, for instance, of Jordan, talking to a number of international venues throughout this crisis and making the very urgent for him point that Jordan is going through some really difficult times. Jordan has had it up to here. Unemployment, the health sector, the educational sector is suffering as a result of an influx of Syrians, and this is something that the Jordanian state can no longer cope with. So he's making a very urgent plea, repeatedly, as a matter of fact, that is shared by Lebanese policymakers and elites. This is an example of a quote from Hariri, Prime Minister Hariri, a few months after King Abdullah made his plea to the American audience. Hariri talks to a Brussels conference on Syria, and he said, well, very similarly, Lebanon is also at a breaking point. The international community needs to realize that Lebanon is having a severely is being severely affected by the Syrian refugee crisis. And in fact, Hariri goes as far as to name a particular price that the international community should offer in terms of a material aid to the Lebanese state for it to cope with the crisis. And he says, well, the international community should be prepared to pay at least $10,000 per refugee in Lebanon for a period of at least half a decade. What makes it interesting here is the extent to which material benefits are linked with narratives of state crisis in both countries. And in fact, this is shared by a number of states worldwide. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, states that are inundated with refugees make similar pleas to the international community of varying degrees of urgency. And this is quite interesting from my perspective, which is a political science perspective, because we lack an international relations approach that allows us to see how migration might fit in the foreign policy making of states or international organizations. What I argue, drawing on work that I've completed with Fiona Adamson, a colleague at SOAS at the University of London, is that we've entered an era in international relations in which migration forms a target of foreign policy making for states, both of Europe and North America, as well as of the global South. And indeed, I argue we should be talking about migration diplomacy. We should be talking about how states use diplomatic processes and procedures to manage cross-border mobility. And if anyone is interested, the article on this is available as an open access article for all of you to peruse. What is of interest for us here, looking at the Syrian refugee crisis, of course, is that how migration diplomacy sort of trickles down to specific policy making on the Jordanian and Lebanese levels. What I argue in this project is that we need to look at refugees as arguably a form of or an instrument of rent. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of rent, what this means and how it's used in political economy circles has to do with resources that are available for states that are then be able to be drawn upon for material gain. Most usually we talk about rent in the form of energy or natural resources. So oil rentier states are states like Saudi Arabia or Libya that are able to draw on the vast natural resources in order to finance a large part of the state bureaucracy. Israel, for instance, would be a strategic rentier state, given the reliance on external income, namely from the United States, because of the strategic relationship between Washington and Israel. I argue very similarly that we should be talking about refugee rentier states, states that host a large number of forcibly displaced population group or groups, and which have come to rely financially on external rent, on refugee rent, in order to survive, and which is linked to these states' treatment of refugees. In fact, I argue that we should be exploring how states develop refugee rent-seeking behavior that looks towards third states, looks towards international organizations for varying types of refugee rent, such as direct economic aid, grants, debt relief, preferential trade treatment, and so on and so forth. Of course, what's interesting here has to do with the varying use of rent in the natural resources versus the refugee side of this. Whereas states like the GCC states would receive funds from international actors in exchange for sharing their natural resources, states that have an inordinate amount of forcibly displaced populations would be expected to receive material benefits from abroad in exchange for containing these populations within their borders rather than sharing them. So this is what I'm exploring in this project. And to make this a bit more concrete, perhaps, we can look at Jordan, first of all. Jordan signs in 2016 a partnership agreement with the European Union, which is an actor increasingly willing to ensure that refugees, to put it quite bluntly, do not make it to the shores of European member states. and engages in a specific agreement called the Jordan Compact in 2016, in which the Jordanian state receives 700 million of grants, plus 700 million more in the coming financial year in exchange for maintaining Syrian refugees within the state's borders. The compact argues that what is needed is a new paradigm that promotes economic development both for Syrian refugee communities as well as Jordanians. And this is something that is quite new in the policy world. And in fact, one of the things that the Jordan Compact stresses is that we need to be looking at the Syrian refugee crisis not as a crisis, but as an opportunity. And in fact, as a developmental opportunity that will allow the Jordanian economy to prosper, and therefore the Jordanian population and the Syrian population within the country to also prosper. If you look across this document that is still very much valid today, we'll see that Jordan is afforded a number of material benefits. One of them has to do with gaining access to the World Bank's concessional financing facility, gaining access to over $147 million worth of low interest loans that are usually not available to that kind of state. However, Jordan, given its condition as a refugee host country, is able to prosper from this over the last few years. At the same time, Jordan is tasked with integrating refugees into specific parts of its economy, namely the special economic zones of the country. And this is aimed at integrating Syrian refugees within the Jordanian labor market, and is seen as an important step towards the empowerment of Syrian forcibly displaced communities that are now living within Jordan. What is interesting here is that in exchange for opening up its labor market to Syrian refugees, the European Union has been willing to grant Jordan tariff-free access for goods produced within those special economic zones. So there is a distinct financial benefit for Jordan to allow refugees into the Jordanian labor market. The caveat here is that Jordan agrees to employ at least 200,000 Syrians in these economic zones. Something very similar happens with Lebanon. In February 2016, Lebanon negotiates its own compact, the Lebanon Compact, within the auspices of the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan. And this is a compact that offers the Lebanese state some 400 million euros worth of aid, over and above, of course, existing pledges. Interestingly, here we see the same type of discourse that the situation needs to be turned into an opportunity that improves the socioeconomic prospects and stability for the whole of Lebanon. So we see, again, some linkages and some similarities between the two cases that need to be critiqued and uncovered. In fact, if we look at the particularities of the Lebanon Compact, we'll see precisely where this, I would say, refugee rent lies. And we'll see that Lebanon has been able to negotiate a number of millions of euros to support all sorts of economic sectors and political sectors, arguably, in the Lebanese state that have little to do with Syrian refugees. So we have a few million euros earmarked for the national plan to safeguard children and women. We have all sorts of money going into solid waste management programs, money to support the Lebanese parliament, and so on and so forth. So these are all examples, I argue, of refugee rent, of money coming in from abroad that is essentially of benefit to the Lebanese state, but doesn't really go directly to the betterment of lives of Syrian refugees. One would say on a first look of all of this, well, that sounds quite positive, right? There is a win-win situation in which, actually triple win situation, in which the international community wins by avoiding spillover effects of refugees flowing into their territories. The host states of first asylum, namely Jordan and Lebanon, benefit from this by getting material benefits, and arguably the Syrian refugees themselves also benefit via a trickle-down economics plan that will allow them to participate in the host state's economic sectors. I argue that we need to approach these schemes a bit more critically. And in fact, I argue in this project that what we see here is migration diplomacy trickling its way dangerously close to something I would call refugee commodification, or using refugees essentially as instruments of economics and material gain. I argue that both the Jordan Compact and the Lebanon Compact proceed with a normative and substantive encouragement of using refugees for material gain. If you look at Jordan, for instance, what you'll see is that for a number of reasons in 2013, the Jordanian government closes the formal crossings with Syria that prevents the entry of Syrian asylum seekers into Jordanian territory. What happens, in fact, is that we have border officials encouraging Syrians to enter the country via informal crossings. And this is something that has a distinct economic repercussion, a positive one, because that means that given that they entered the country informally, Syrians that did so are recognized prima facie as refugees. So this is something that allows the Jordanian government to increase its estimates of Syrian refugees within its territory. Perhaps more concretely, in Lebanon, what we see is the establishment of a law that expects all Syrians over the age of 15 to pay a $200 residency fee from January 2015 onwards. This is something quite interesting, and given that about 70% of the Syrians living in Lebanon live below the poverty line. What this has led to, of course, is a number of arbitrary arrests of those Syrians that can't afford to pay the residency fee. And of course, that trickles down to even more refugee rent-seeking behavior by local actors within police precincts who have been accused of engaging with these Syrians in order to release them informally in exchange for some amount of money. From July 2014 onwards, for a bit of time, Jordan put forth a bailout process in which Syrian refugees that were living within refugee camps were actually able to exit them if they had a sponsorship agreement with a Jordanian citizen. What this meant is that we have a very interesting informal arrangement emerge, in which, according to the UNHCR, we have Syrians paying middlemen about $500 in order to be bailed out by unknown Jordanian citizens. So yet again, this is an example of what I would call refugee rent, in which we have Jordanian citizens benefiting from the plight of Syrian refugees eager to leave a refugee camp merely by the fact that they can sponsor them, merely by the fact that they're Jordanian citizens. This becomes a bit more extreme in Lebanon. According to a number of reports that we see in Beirut and elsewhere, we have individual sponsorship sold for up to $1,000. So I have quotes that mention how sponsors, Lebanese citizens, are actually making a business out of selling sponsorships to Syrian refugees. In fact, they wait on the Syrian border or they wait at the airport to sell sponsorship to new arrivals. What you see here, I argue, is this increasing trend towards refugee commodification, arguably encouraged by the state's own tendency to look at refugees as a form of rent. If you look more closely at what happens to the national economies, you'll see that the Jordan Compact in particular has created a number of issues for other vulnerable communities in the country. You will see, for instance, that I argue refugee rent leads to novel ways for global South countries to become dependent on international donors. If you remember a few minutes ago, I mentioned that Jordan promises to provide 200,000 employment posts for Syrian refugees. Of course, Jordan, for a number of reasons, is unable to provide these posts. And what ends up happening is this tension between Jordan and the international community. And of course, that trickles down to a very deleterious effect, namely an ongoing process of harassment and discrimination and also imprisonment and deportation of other vulnerable migrant and refugee communities. In particular, Egyptians had to face a number of Ministry of Labor campaigns against them, partly because this would, I argue, pave the way for Syrians to be able to take up these much needed employment opportunities. So you see yet again the extent to which this commodification of refugees is able to trickle down into potentially harming other migrant and refugee groups within the country. Finally, what is interesting here, of course, is that this refugee rent-seeking behavior tends to affect how the states react to refugees themselves. Of course, the decision to construct refugee camps in Jordan in order to render the displaced population visible to international donors hopefully makes sense now. You can see why we have these pictures of the Zatari camp and in its enormity, partly because Jordan wants to highlight this issue to attract more funding. What we have, of course, also in Jordan, in particular, is accusations of Syrian refugees' numbers being inflated in order to magnify the issue that the state is facing. So the numbers range anything from 650, 660,000 officially registered refugees to 1.5 million, according to the Jordanian government. We have, of course, this ongoing narrative of crisis and state incapacity that we see in quotes by King Abdallah, by Hariri, and by a range of policymakers. I argue, of course, we can see that this is serving certain foreign policy purposes, but arguably it is also risking inciting xenophobia, accentuating social tensions against these communities that are now seen as scapegoats for unemployment, for inaccessible healthcare services, and so on and so forth. What is interesting here, of course, is the more we try to unpack these states and the migrant populations and refugee populations that live in them, we see that Syrian refugees tend to be perceived as more privileged vis-a-vis other migrant and refugee groups. I mentioned the example of Egyptians in Jordan, but this is not all. One of the interesting things that is coming up here has to do with how Syrian refugees are constantly, or used to be constantly, at the center of attention of international donors. And this, of course, marginalized the needs and the plight of a range of other refugee and migrant communities in both countries. Arguably, it also marginalizes the plight of vulnerable Jordanian and Lebanese citizens as well. And this is something that we need to take into account. And the final point, because I've run out of time, has to do with, I argue, an ever-present phenomenon of policy diffusion, in the sense that the amount of material gains that the Jordanian and Lebanese state were able to accrue from the international community in 2016 have served arguably as examples, good or bad, depending on where you lie, in terms of how other states might respond to this. Just a couple of examples we'll see, for instance, in Uganda, where a long inquiry found that refugee numbers were exaggerated tremendously in Uganda, partly in order to make this problem appear much more urgent than it is, and to highlight the need for more international aid flowing to Uganda. And of course, on the other side of this, we have to acknowledge that there is something to be said about refugees, host states making increasingly belligerent claims, if you want, towards the international community in order to accrue much needed material benefits and material support. Of all states, you saw, of course, that Jordan and Lebanon made veiled attempts at state collapse if the international community is not forthcoming with aid. Something similar happens in Kenya, of all places, which holds the world's largest refugee camp, the Dadaab camp. And of course, Kenya, at the same time as negotiations were taking place with Jordan and Lebanon, threatens to close down the refugee camp unless it receives more international aid from the international community. So you see the perils of refugee rent-seeking behavior if the international community continues to employ these modes of action. And of course, much closer to home in Europe than Kenya, Turkey is another example of this, where we have refugee rent-seeking behavior taken to the extreme, where we have Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan coming out in 2016 again. Bear in mind the similarity in terms of the timing of all of this, and negotiating with European Union policymakers and elites, and argue that, well, we actually have all the cards in our hands. There's nothing really that the European Union can do. We can put refugees on buses and send them over. So how will you deal with these refugees if you don't make a deal? Will you kill them? And this is arguably, I argue in my project, the extent to which refugee rent-seeking behavior and refugee rentierism might actually affect how states and how international organizations commodify refugees and see them not, of course, as individuals, as human beings, as communities that need protection, but as objects of material gain, as essentially objects that can be issue linked with other things like economic aid and so on and so forth. So this, I argue, these are the lessons that we can draw so far from how Jordan and Lebanon reacted to the Syrian refugee crisis, and how we should try to ring a warning bell against refugee deals or compacts, quote unquote, that ostensibly try to help both these host states as well as the vulnerable populations within them, but ultimately in the way that they're perceived and the way they operationalize aid might be making more harm than good. And 25 minutes in, that's it. Thank you very much. Over to you, Tufik.
Well, thank you, Gerasimos, for a fascinating talk right there. I very much look forward to the discussion that we'll have, and that the questions that we'll receive from audience members here. I would encourage folks who would be interested to pose a question to Gerasimos to put them in the question and answer section. Normally, after a lecture of that gravity, it takes a little time to somewhat absorb things. So that's the purpose of my discussion with Gerasimos now for the next 15 to 20 minutes. Take your time, formulate your ideas, and put them in the question and answer section in your Zoom room, so to speak. Well, firstly, Gerasimos, I'd like to thank you for a very rich and, I would argue, quite intellectually and politically daring set of ideas formulated around this concept of refugee rentierism. I think you've made a pretty good case for explaining both what rent is and what refugee rentierism is, and that we can identify forms of refugee rent-seeking behavior. What I'd like to sort of ask you, or start off by asking you, is to what extent do you see this? Why did it seems obvious why you chose the Rentier framework, but do you also see this as a kind of outsourcing arrangement? I mean, if we're going with political economy sort of sets of ideas for how to analyze what is taking place.
Absolutely. So I think the concept of rent, and of course it's being developed in all sorts of ways since it came up in Middle East politics in the 1970s. I think what's particularly interesting about this is that it shows us two sides of the coin. So it shows us, of course, on the one hand, the plight of host states of first asylum in the Middle East and the global South more generally, in the sense that they're really in desperate need of material support, primarily because, of course, as you know as well, forced migration tends to affect global South countries much more than it does Europe or North America in terms of direct flows of forcibly displaced populations. So it gives us that side, but it also gives us the other side, which is the side of states across the global North and arguably international organizations that are willing to provide material benefits to these states in exchange for keeping those refugees within their borders. So I think that that twist is interesting, and I think it says a lot about the recent trend towards externalizing refugee management to the global north periphery. And of course, Jordan and Lebanon are two examples, but we can see it in North Africa, for instance, in terms of EU agreements with North African states. We can see it in what Donald Trump tried to do with Mexico in what seems like ages ago, but it was only a few months ago, actually. So we can see it in terms of how refugee rent is instrumentalized by both sides, arguably.
Great. I'm kind of interested to sort of pursue further the idea of the different strategies that states use when they engage in their rent-seeking behavior. The main examples that you raised in your lecture focused on Jordan and Lebanon. But the state that has the largest refugee population, Syrian refugee population, is Turkey, of course. And you mentioned at the end of your lecture the sort of more hard-nosed approach, I mean, it speaks for itself, his words, vis-a-vis the European Union, and a sort of very, very threatening tone and very sort of callous approach, shall we say. Can you speak to what are the factors and that lead to different forms of strategy and approach and discourse, and the kind of ideas of leverage that how states perceive their own leverage vis-a-vis what they might be able to get when they actually engage in this rent-seeking behavior?
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that I've uncovered in terms of my research project and my methodology in this, which is interviewing elites across Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. What I found is that they are quite capable of understanding the extent to which they can play their hand, quote unquote, vis-a-vis international targets. So what we see in Turkey very, very evidently is a sense that given their proximity to the European Union, that we just have a land border in Evros with Greece or a sea border across the Aegean Sea, and given the amount of refugees that had flown into Turkey, they were able to use much more extreme rhetoric vis-a-vis the European Union. I call it, in IR terms, I call it blackmailing. So they were able to engage in blackmailing strategies vis-a-vis Brussels. So you remember from that last quote that I said, that I circulated, Erdogan had a very belligerent tone here, partly because he thought that, well, since I'm very close to my target, and since I have so many refugees that can immediately flow into the European Union, then I can afford to be belligerent. If you look back in time, you'll see that somebody else that was close to Europe and had a large number of refugees able to be sent across the border is Gaddafi in Libya. So Muammar Gaddafi in the 90s and 2000s would also engage in belligerent attitudes vis-a-vis Italy in particular, partly because he knew that this threat was so immediate that he could afford to be belligerent. In Jordan and Lebanon, what we see is a bit of a different approach, partly because policymakers there understood that they lack one of these two factors. Of course, they have a large number of refugees, but they're not contiguous vis-a-vis the European Union. So if Jordan were to say, well, I'm just going to kick all the Syrian refugees out and put them in buses unless the European Union funds me, the European Union there is no direct route for them to go there. So they adopted a much less belligerent approach that I call back scratching. So their approach has been very much help us, help you, help us in a way. So it is very much a narrative of either appealing to international norms or appealing to a sense of duty by the international community. And you see there's such a wide distance between Erdogan doing this belligerent tone and King Abdallah in Jordan putting forth a much less belligerent rhetoric. So I argue that when you have both of these factors present, a large number of refugees and a immediate proximity or geopolitical importance of the country, then you're much more likely to see blackmail processes. If you're missing either of those, then the state tends to be much more conciliatory on this. I don't know if that grasps your question.
No, great answer. Thank you. Another question that I had related to the actual Rentier framework. You mentioned the Rentier state theory that sort of comes out of the 70s and particularly analyzing the Gulf states in particular. But when we take this concept and apply it to refugees and the concept of refugee rentierism, we begin to sort of see a longer historical sort of track record of this perhaps taking place. And here I'm thinking in particular about Jordan and the Jordanian state, where if you spend enough time in the Levant region, there tends to be a kind of feeling that Jordan has benefited off of many of the crises that have taken place in the region from its instability and its instabilities, be that Iraq, Lebanon, the situation in Israel, Palestine, and now, of course, Syria. Can you speak to the evolution of refugee rentier states, and particularly the Jordanian example, and what might be different or new about its evolution in the Syrian refugee incarnation, so to speak?
Yeah,
and would you agree that the refugee rentierism in Jordan in particular has been a phenomena that is carried forth and now takes on its current incarnation?
That's a great question, actually. The argument I'm making in terms of Jordan in particular, which I agree is a fascinating case vis-a-vis like the Levant, is that this approach to securing aid from international donors has been present from the very beginning. So I don't mean to essentialize or orientalize the state, but I think most of us would agree that from Transjordan up until today, we see that because of a number of reasons, Jordan has been reliant on international aid to support the state, to support the military, to support its functioning over time. And in fact, I did a bit of archival work for this project in London, and you'd be surprised. I mean, I don't know if you'd be surprised, you might not be surprised to find out that similar rationale existed right after the First Arab-Israeli War. So the Jordanian responses to the Nakba had a lot to do with, well, we are able to host these refugees, these Palestinians, because of course we'll do what we can, but we need support. And of course, UNRWA becomes involved in this in all sorts of ways. And that continues in 1967, continues with the Iraqis, much more recently, of course, up until today. So you'll see that this is an ever-present phenomenon. In terms of an evolution, I would say very interestingly, Jordan evolves firstly, in terms of the targets of this. The rent-seeking behavior initially targets the British and the Americans. More recently, seems to be a much more global approach to the West. We see Jordan developing all sorts of strategies vis-a-vis the European Union, vis-a-vis the UNHCR. So last time I was in Amman a year or so ago, I was struck by the extent to which the Jordanian state bureaucracy had developed all sorts of mechanisms to talk to international donors. So that's one difference that didn't exist in the past. And the second difference, I would say, in terms of the evolution of the Jordanian refugee rentier state, has to do with the extent to which it's able to diffuse its model regionally. So Lebanon, for instance, in its negotiations with a number of European Union partners, would defer to the Jordanian delegation to do the negotiating part. So there was a process of learning by the Lebanese state from the Jordanian experience. So this element of cross-border cooperation, cross-border diffusion is also something new, I think. But arguably, I think it's been the same type of mindset does tend to go back quite a few decades.
I'll ask one more question because it seems we have a lot of questions from the audience, which I'm happy to get to soon. But I'll leave it at this. Your talk tended to focus mostly, when you speak and conceptualize rent, of rent being having monetary value and the material gain aspect of it. Can you speak to, there's another dimension of rent that could be considered a political rent and political concessions that countries may be able to extract as a function of these arrangements. In the Syrian refugee example, or perhaps others, can you speak to the political dimensions of political rent that might be extracted?
Yeah, that's great. I wasn't thinking of the political side or the immaterial side, right? To put it in more critical terms, I suppose. I wasn't thinking of this partly because the Jordanian and Lebanese state were so stricken for material support that it didn't seem relevant to them, and Turkey, of course, as well. But if you look at other cases in the Middle East, for instance, you'll see that this sort of political support carries a lot of weight. I was reading a paper by Kelsey Norman, by Dr. Norman, who works on Egypt and North Africa. And she was exploring how the Sisi regime in Egypt responded to the Syrian refugee crisis and more broadly, the sort of Eastern Mediterranean refugee crisis. And what she found out from her interviews in Cairo is that Egyptians didn't really want European funding so much. What they really wanted, and I'm putting it very simply, I suppose, and crudely, is they were looking for normative support. They were quite keen to have Sisi being presented as a recognized leader, as a partner of European Union states, as a key actor in terms of managing North African responses to the refugee crisis. So for a country like Egypt, for instance, the political aspect of refugee rent matters much more. For a number of reasons, that's not the case in the Lebanese and Jordanian case, but I think it's equally valid. These immaterial support mechanisms that can be granted to refugee states, we haven't really explored them yet, and I think they're definitely there. I think they're definitely there.
Fantastic, Gerasimos. So I'm going to transition to taking questions from the audience. I encourage people to put those questions down there, but please be succinct with the questions because it's not always so easy to sort of read them and synthesize them and get them back to Gerasimos. So we'll start with a question from Professor Dawn Chatty, who writes the following. She writes, "Thank you, Gerasimos. I have read your articles on this topic and now I look forward to reading the book. I wonder, do you think that the Jordanian government felt that it missed an opportunity then by not forcing Iraqi refugees in camps 5 years ago?"
No, that's a great question, Professor Chatty. I think my understanding of this, given interviews in Jordan, is that the Jordanian government did think that there are a few missed opportunities in how they manage the Syrian refugee crisis, firstly. So one of the things that I mentioned in my work is this quote that I heard over and over in a number of ways from policymakers that, well, look at what Turkey gained out of this. It gained 6 billion euros, and look at what we gained. And we really should have blackmailed the European Union like Turkey did. So there was a lot of regret in terms of the strategy that they employed, firstly on the Syrian refugee crisis. The extent to which it would have changed is open to debate, of course. I think that in terms of the Iraqis, my sense is that they wouldn't have benefited much more from an incumbent policy there, partly because there was a significant amount of refugee rent being granted to Jordanians from the presence of the Iraqi community there. So we're talking about specific neighborhoods in Amman, we're talking about specific occupations, we're talking about purchases of flats and land. All of this, I think, would not have been there if they had pursued a much different policy of setting up camps. So I think arguably looking back, probably it was it was economically beneficial for the Jordanian state as it transpired.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from someone called Line Robin, who writes, the figures and trends that you have introduced date from 2016 and 2017. What about today? Is it still the same trend? In Lebanon especially, are there any changes considering the crisis in the country?
Oh, there's tremendous changes. You're absolutely right. The changes, I think, are twofold. Firstly, they have to do with the emergence of specific global norms around the issue of refugee management. So the global refugee regime has shifted to take into account the benefit, quote unquote, that can be accrued from such migration management techniques. So if you look, for instance, at the emergence of the Global Refugee Compact, you'll see that this sort of win-win crisis as a developmental opportunity sort of rhetoric is embedded in those documents. And these are, of course, widely negotiated and agreed. So I think that's partly what has changed. The second thing that has changed, I think, is that 2016, I don't know if Tufika agrees, 2016 was really the heyday of the international community's focus on the Syrian refugee crisis. Things went a bit awry once the EU-Turkey statement was signed in mid-2016. After that, Syrian refugees tended to step to the sidelines of international news. Once the global pandemic hit, there is even less of an effort to continue supporting Lebanon and Jordan to the extent that they were before. So I think both of these have changed remarkably, but I think the 2015-2016 period is indicative of this broader trend that might actually resurface once we go back to seeing refugees as a central piece of global news.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Miriam Twicht, who thanks you for your very interesting talk and has a question. I'll try and synthesize it. She writes, I was wondering if Gerasimos could extend on his remarks regarding the Prima Facie refugee status of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. As far as I've ever been able to find, Syrian refugees were de jure Prima Facie refugees in contrast to refugees from South and Middle Iraq in the period between 2006 and 2009. I understood this in line with the 1998 Memorandum of Understanding and the remarks that for recognized refugees, a durable solution needs to be found outside of Jordan. But maybe I have been horribly wrong. I would really like to know more about what Gerasimos means by Prima Facie, what is actually formulated on people's documents, and if possible, also for my own work. And what are your sources?
Absolutely. I would say the easiest thing for this, Miriam, is if you send me an email, feel free to, and we can discuss sources and we can discuss this. So what I meant by this is the Jordan, not Lebanon. So I'm talking about Syrian refugees coming into Jordan informally in that period where the formal border crossings were closed, and at the time at which the UNHCR was still allowed to register Syrian refugees, because as you probably know, that stopped a few years later. So at this precise time, we are talking about Syrians, not Palestinians, Syrian refugees being counted officially as being taken as prima facie refugees within the country without any further need of examination. But that changed relatively soon afterwards. But I'm happy to talk over email perhaps for that specific point.
Okay. We have a question from Carlos Jair Martinez, who asked several questions related to, I guess, the migration of Syrians and Levantines, Palestinians, Lebanese, to South America in the 1880s. But his question, he has several questions. The one I think most relevant here to the discussion relates to how Latin American countries may be dealing with Syrian refugees today. And perhaps if I could expand on that, what about countries that are not actually these countries that are have these huge refugee populations but are doing repatriation? Is there any element of refugee rentierism going on there?
That's a great question, actually. I wish I could tell you more about Latin America, but I can only tell you the extent to which I know of the cases via an article I'm co-authoring with a great colleague of mine called Feline Freyer. So if, Carlos, you're interested in this, I would look her up and look up her work. And what we're arguing in that article is that Latin American countries also developed policies of refugee rentierism, particularly with regard to Ecuador. So if you look at the situation as it has evolved over the last few years, you'll see that there is also an element of refugee rentierism diffusion taking place there as well, which shouldn't surprise you, because this is something that is becoming a global phenomenon. I don't know more about Syrian refugees there per se. All I know is that there is an element of solidarity and a Syrian community there, but I would direct you to Feline for a bit more work actually on this.
Okay, William Falk, does refugee rent specifically refer to situations where the money is not being used to benefit the refugees?
I would say yes. So the understanding of this is that it is an unearned source of income, in the sense that the money that is directly going to the support of Syrian refugees should not be considered an instrument of economic rent, of refugee rent, but any sort of other money or material benefits that go to the betterment, what was my example in the presentation, the Lebanese parliament, for instance, or the support of vulnerable Jordanian communities. There's a lot of examples of, for instance, international aid granted for building of schools in Jordan and all sorts of things like this. One point of this, Tufik, if I may, because it's a good point I should have mentioned in my lecture, has to do with a very interesting approach to the Jordanian policymaking vis-a-vis international donors, where we have a set requirement that at any point where an international donor wants to give some money to Syria to support Syrian refugees in Jordan, the Jordanian government will come in and say that you also need to provide a certain percentage of that money to support vulnerable Jordanians. And it varies, I think it's now 50-50 or a bit less than this. My question, of course, to the Jordanians when I was interviewing them was, well, what do you do if you have a state that wants to support Syrian refugees in your country, but doesn't want to match that funding with funding for Jordanians as well? And the answer is that they would reject the funding. So they would not take up money if that money did not also involve a distinct refugee rentier component, which I think is quite interesting.
Great. We have a question from Valbiner Karsten, who writes, would you also regard Turkey as a state benefiting from hosting refugees as Jordan and Lebanon in your heavily disputable, given that the so-called, quote, refugee deal provides Turkey with 6 billion euros against expenses of the Turkish state and society, which already exceed the amount of 25 billion euros?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I do consider Turkey to be a refugee rentier state, given the amount of support it is getting from the international community. What I want to make clear, however, in this is that I'm not taking a side. I'm trying very hard to not take a side for or against what host states of refugees are doing to secure material benefits. I've talked to people across all three states, and one of the common aspects here has to do with the firstly, the generosity of the states, that they opened up their border and allowed Syrians to come and live in Lebanon, in Turkey, and in Jordan, but also the extent to which this was economically harmful for these three states. So the refugee rentier framework doesn't really take a normative stance for or against this phenomenon, much like oil rentierism doesn't really say, well, Saudi Arabia is bad because it relies on oil to support its state. So I completely sympathize with the argument, and I hope I wasn't making a normative assumption here. So,
no worries. We have a question from Dalal Stevens, who asks, to what extent do you think UNHCR and NGOs are complicit in this refugee rentier model because of protection difficulties in the region and lack of resettlement options?
I wouldn't, great question. I wouldn't go so far as saying complicit. I would say that the framework of cooperation, of international cooperation in both Lebanon and Jordan, such as the 3RP, for instance, and all this, is reliant on the involvement of NGOs, of UNHCR and other NGOs. To the extent to which they have the power to undermine or object the rules agreed is something that is open to interpretation. My understanding of this from my work in the region is that NGOs tend to typically follow the consensus across interstate agreements and do their best in terms of protecting these vulnerable populations. But if you were to take an objective look or a snapshot of what's happening in Jordan, Lebanon, they absolutely, they are involved in the management of Syrian refugees, and they are very much involved in the production and reproduction of refugee rent.
Great. We have a question from Dr. Henry Hoger, who writes, European willingness to take Syrian refugees has been paltry, with one or two exceptions. Do you think, quote, migration diplomacy by, for example, Jordan and Lebanon can persuade Europeans that part of the answer might be more generous asylum policies of their own, not just financial contributions to rentier host countries?
That's a good question. Hope there is a hope that this is the outcome, although I'm not optimistic. What we see, I work in Britain, so what you see, for instance, in the UK government, but also elsewhere in other European states, is the approach of, as Tufik said, externalizing this phenomenon to host states across the periphery, of providing material support and of increasing the capacity of refugee host states, precisely so that the problem doesn't reach global north shores. So I'm not optimistic vis-a-vis that. What I could say is that the phenomenon of providing refugee rent to countries like Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey is a short-term solution. So unless there are long-term solutions being put on the ground, then it is highly unlikely that this will solve the matter of global refugee governance. So perhaps once we get to a point where we see that the phenomenon of refugee rentierism has diffused across the global south, and it's actually untenable for Europe and North America to continue just paying annual sums of money, then there might be an understanding that we need to engage in a much more just and perhaps humane, I would say as well, solution to the management of refugees.
Thank you. We have another question from Dr. Alex Bellam, who writes, thank you, Gerasimos, for your very interesting talk. I want to ask about Syrians who come and go across the border. To my knowledge, there are very many who do this, as did Iraqi groups before the Syrian war. Are these included in the Jordanian Lebanese government figures? And how do these groups fit into your analysis?
They're not. To my understanding, they're not. So in terms of Jordanian numbers in particular, but also Lebanese, this type of cyclical migration, if you want to call it that, is something that is not accounted for. Whether they affect the analysis or not, I would say the numbers are such that at the end of the day, the argument still holds. And I would say even if we are talking about a type of migration that is of large numbers, then it would probably just strengthen the framework rather than weaken it. But I would say if you want to think about it theoretically, the only way it would affect the argument would be if this is migration that somehow makes it to the shores of global North donors. And it doesn't, because we're talking about migration across borders in Lebanon and Jordan. So I say it doesn't really make a lot of difference, actually.
Okay. We had two questions from Lara Ashawaure, but I'm going to just take one of them just for purposes of time and for the fact that we have a fair amount of other questions to go through. She writes, your argument regarding making economic deals for hosting refugees is understood, but how can poor countries like Jordan and Lebanon host that number of refugees? In brackets, the most two hosting countries in the world in regards to their population per capita, I imagine she means, without the help of the international community. What alternatives do you think that they have in order to manage this situation?
Yeah, great question. No, I do not mean to imply at all that these countries should be self-sufficient. And I think I try to make that clear from the very beginning, that these are countries that are really inordinately affected by forced migration. So there is something that has to be done about this. You're talking to somebody who would be, I suppose, a bit of a neo-realist in IR terms. But I would say the answer to your question has to do with going back to the way the international community is supposed to work, going back to the basis of the global refugee regime and seeing why is it that institutions like UNHCR have been unable to cater to the demands of these refugee communities. And you'll see that there is a problem there that has to do, this is what Alexander Betts writes about from Oxford. This has to do with the way the refugee regime has been undermined over a number of years in order to essentially prioritize the needs and the wishes of richer states of the global north. So I would say the way forward might be to go back and revisit how the global refugee regime works and how we can restore some sort of semblance of order. But I completely share your point in the sense that there is the need to restore agency in countries like Lebanon and Jordan, given the plight of refugees within their territory. So I completely agree.
We have a question from Yusuf Lema, who asks, is it not more cost effective and beneficial for the EU to address the root problem of the refugees at the source rather than treating the current consequences, or is it too complicated politically?
That's yes. So with my students, I teach migration politics for my third year students in Birmingham, and this is one of the questions that I have them answer for their essays. So I wish I could do it justice in 30 seconds, but I would say, Yusuf, that it would be logical to say that these problems should be treated in terms of the root problems rather than the consequences. And there's only so much you can do if you continue just addressing the consequences of this. It's a political quagmire. Try convincing European member states that the Syrian civil war was partly due to colonial or post-colonial involvement. So it's, Tufik, I don't know what you think about this, but it's arguably there is something to be said about how it is much easier for European and North American countries to treat the consequences of this on the short term than to try to address it in any sort of long-term solution. But unfortunately or not, the way the refugee rentier state sort of way of dealing with this problem provides a short-term solution, like a patch over this problem that meets the expectations of a number of Western governments, unfortunately.
Sure. We have a question from Marta Trigiano, I hope I got that right, who asks, it seems to me that in their essence, Jordan or Lebanon, the Jordan or Lebanon compacts and the EU-Turkey statement deal show a similar, quote, rental behavior, an intention to instrumentalize refugees as commodities. Why do you think the Turkey deal was highly criticized while Jordan and Lebanon deals might be seen as, quote, best practice?
Gosh, that's a brilliant question, actually. That's a very tricky question as well. I would say that it might go back to what Tufik asked at the very beginning of the session, which has to do with the different negotiating practices. So the fact that the EU-Turkey deal was predicated on a particularly belligerent approach by Turkey may have to do with the fact that it was vilified almost immediately. I would say we can go beyond that sort of initial assumption and look at the very arguments of, look at the very sort of processes that the three agreements stipulate, right? So you will see, for instance, that in the EU-Turkey deal agreement, we have Turkey being designated a safe country for the return of Syrian refugees from Greece and Europe, which is a problematic statement. You will see a very sort of instrumentalist approach in terms of securing visa-free access to European Union member states for Turkish citizens. So beyond perhaps the negotiating tactics behind it, you could also say that it's been criticized partly because it stipulated things that are quite problematic, like the very specifics of the EU-Turkey deal actually proved to work to the expense of Syrian refugees rather at all to any of their favor.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have a question from Sara Pan Algara, who asks, usually the narrative is that the EU is not benefiting from hosting refugees, but rather the opposite. Can one make the case that the EU has also taken a rentier approach to the refugee crisis and that the EU has followed a migration diplomacy approach?
The EU, I would argue, yes, take a look at my piece with Fiona. The EU's approach to this is to develop a very concrete migration diplomacy strategy that rests very much on questions of externalization, of linking aid to management, of preventing, for instance, the outflow of refugees from Libya across the Mediterranean. So all of this have to do with a very concrete migration diplomacy plan. Very interestingly, I don't know how you define the EU, but if you look at individual EU member states, you'll see very interestingly how they also adopt refugee rent-seeking strategies. So I'm Greek, originally born and raised, and one of the things that I've been interested to watch is how the previous Greek government under Tsipras instrumentalized Syrian refugees to quite an extent. At some point, Panos Kamenos, who used to be the Minister of Defense, was saying that, well, this was in the process of the bailout negotiations with Brussels. Panos Kamenos was quoted as saying, well, we'll open up the borders and we'll let the refugees go all the way to Berlin unless Germany and Chancellor Merkel agrees to give us a better bailout deal. So I don't think refugee rentierism is a global South phenomenon, and we shouldn't essentialize it as such. We can see it in the negotiations between the Italian government and Brussels for more money to cater to the needs of the Italians. We can see it in Greece. So we can see it in Eastern Europe as well, actually. So this is a lot to do with an asymmetry of power between states. It could be Jordan and Lebanon vis-a-vis global North states. It could be the so-called European South versus the so-called European North. So I think it happens intra-EU as well as outside the EU.
Great. We have time for one more question. We're basically at time now, but
sorry to feel like it's been a bit busy. It seems.
No, on the contrary, it's been great and very lively, and I thank our audience as well as congratulate you for your ability to play a very good ping pong game or tennis game, so to speak. The question that I wanted to, the final question that I wanted to pick out here was one going back to one Yusuf Lama, who asked a question that is, what is your estimate of the percentage of actual grants and aid that eventually filter down to individual refugees after all administrative, management, and other costs have been dealt with?
I wish I had a figure. I don't have a precise number. And this is partly why this needs much more research than I have done already. So this is the next step in what I'm trying to do, is establish the extent to which European Union and Western aid is actually trickling down to individual refugees. Because the problem here has to do with a question that another person asked earlier on in terms of establishing refugee rent. So how much, so say Jordan receives X number of millions of dollars. Well, how do you calculate the needs of each refugee living in Jordan? And how are you able to separate that from the rest of the money accrued? It's a very difficult estimate. The only sort of number I have is the number that Hariri talked about back in 2016, where he said, well, we need about $12,000 per year per refugee in Lebanon. The extent to which that actually trickles down to them is dubious in terms of the money that Lebanon has been able to secure internationally. So, yes. I have, Tufik, can I ask, I see something from Vanessa, because she asked a question twice. Do you mind if I answer it very, very fast?
Sure. Well, let's read it. Thanks to Gerasimos for the interesting presentation. I wonder, how do you see the different positions of the Jordanian and Lebanese governments with respect to the return of Syrian refugees? Interestingly, the Lebanese authorities participated in the International Conference of Refugee Return organized by the Syrian regime and supported by Russia, while the Jordanians did not participate.
Yeah, no, I think it's a brilliant question, partly because it ties into a whole underexplored aspect of this that has to do with, well, how do you manage the return of Syrian refugees and refugee communities? And I would say it ties, my initial explanation at least, is that it ties to the narratives that the two governments have put forth vis-a-vis Syrian refugees. so for Jordan, we have very much a narrative of Syrian refugees being welcome, Syrian refugees being sheltered. That goes back to Tufek's question about how the Jordanian state manages refugees going back to the Palestinians fleeing the war in 1948. So if Jordan was to participate in the conference and start arguing for the return of Syrian refugees, then that would invalidate their claim to hospitality, the whole sort of basis of the Jordanian Rentier state more generally. So I say it has a lot to do with rhetoric, and it has a lot to do with state identity. It also has a lot to do with the particular economic plight of the Lebanese state vis-a-vis refugees that is not shared, I think, with the Jordanian state. So I think I'm giving you a short answer to a very, very complex question, I think. But thank you for raising it.
Well, thank you for all your answers tonight, as well as for your lecture. We've pretty much run out of time because people's attention span in the Zoom Corona era has more or less topped out. But with that said, we have at least 62 participants who hung on for a good hour and 20 minutes. I'd like to thank you, Gerasimos, for your lecture, as well as the audience members for all their questions and their participation today. Please check out our website to see some of the forthcoming webinars that we have planned, as well as recordings of the previous webinars that we have, as well as the different activities that the Council for British Research in Levant organizes. You can find all that stuff at cbrl.ac.uk, and you can also sign up as a member. So check us out online, and otherwise have a great evening. Thank you all.
Thank you.